In this episode of Boring Conversations, I sit with Dr. Uche Peter Umezurike. Doctor granted us a chance to talk to him on many fronts. We had the opportunity to talk about the lives of women and how their sorrows and their silent pains need to be brought to the forefront and need to be looked at specifically for what they are. We talk about the different tastes and the different shapes in which many persons come to perceive love. We talked about children's literature. We talked about how conversations should continue as to the continuous failures posed by our leaders and how we should go and how we should look at our lives and how we should reinforce our will and our desire to come to have that succor we get to find when we travel abroad. We looked at the political class and how they have continually failed our people, how they have continually failed us. We looked at the intersections of literature and how that gets to reflect in his own life. We looked at migration. We did a cross-cutting comparison, not so much between Romeo Oriogon's Nomad, and we looked at Abdurazak Guna's The Sea, and we looked at how map and the sense of migration gets to influence the way in which we get to live life one way or the other. By and large, that was we talking about globalization. That was we talking about how we live in the 21st century, how we ordinarily should move on into the future and our roles in that particular dispensation and this particular dispensation as well. We looked at the urgent need for literature presented to children and how these children of ours should, one way or the other, come to look at literature and come to appreciate the art and the things that need to be done to see to it that children, our own children, come to be the leaders indeed of tomorrow, not just mere rhetorics. In and about these are the conversations we had. And it will be a thing of great pleasure and delight for me if you stop by and have the time to listen to our conversations. I am Biringkpa in Mecca. Welcome to Boring Conversations. Today we'll be talking about the many lives he lives through his writing, the questions he keeps returning to, the stories that haunt him, if there are any, and what it means to write about home, especially when home is both a place and a memory, when home is where you get to drink and eat and sleep, and where you get to remember, and where you have to go back to once in a while. We'll also get to ask Doctor about his time in Nigeria, his work, and the university life in Port Harcourt. The same thing we did also with Dr. Nimi Waribogo, asking him about his time in Port Harcourt before moving to the United States. We'll also be discussing literature's place in shaping society, Africa's intellectual future in a time where even the National Library in a place like Nigeria is yet to be completed 20 years plus down the line. We'll also be talking about the evolving voices of the diaspora and the problems many persons get to proceed as it concerns what diaspora writing is in relation to Africa. Who are African writers? African writers, writers who write about Africa. The same question that was raised in the conversations about what African philosophy is during the times of the likes of Mvumbi and different persons down there. Doctor, thank you for granting us a chance to talk to you. Welcome to Boring Conversations.
Thank you very much, Obina. It's my pleasure to be having this conversation with you to use this opportunity to reflect on home, migration, identity, belonging, poetry, arts, literature, and other cultural issues of our time. And I think these are pertinent conversations and questions to be looking at, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to really delve into them and see how we can even contest some of those nativist and narrow ways of thinking about home and belonging and identity.
Thank you, Doctor. The very first poem, as I said in the introduction, when I got hold of your book and I looked at it and it gripped me. It's a thing that I've been concerned about myself. One also who is not at the moment in the country. You said home is what the tortoise bears on its back: a shell, a heartbreak, a mosaic of routes, a scent of hibiscus, a memory of rainwater, the struggle to stay sane. What about this? How should we be looking at home in this context, and how do we navigate this? Is it something you still hold on to now? Is it something you are still reflecting on? Is it something you are adding, or like they say, poems get to be written in sometimes in a hurry, sometimes well thought out also, but they leave a lot unsaid. Is it the case down here, or everything has been covered?
Yeah, I think, thank you for such a complex contemplation of home and migration. I think being in the diaspora, one either has to reconcile with the fact that they may never recreate home. What they may be recreating is just a sense or a memory of home. And then the other thing would be you may want to live with that struggle that home has to be ongoing. It's not rooted or fixed in time. If you I think it's a difficult subject for so many people, because if you came to the diaspora at your old age, it would be more challenging for you to sever the ties you had with home and then reinvent home in the new country. But for those who came at a very young age, maybe at the age of 4 or 5, they wouldn't have forged those ties that always remind them that home is elsewhere. And so for me, that poem offers a way to think about home using the image of the tortoise, which always moves around. The tortoise does not stay in one location. It's not rooted to one piece of earth. It's always moving. And then it carries its home wherever it goes. And so I was thinking, could that be a way to cultivate that disposition while one is living in the diaspora? Should one have that sort of openness or nomadic mindset that even though you live in the diaspora, you came from elsewhere, home doesn't have to mean one thing. And so that poem was a way for me to my attempt to think about an openness to this question and struggle of home not being fixed, particularly if one has chosen to leave their home in search of a new home in some other country. And so I don't have any definite answer, and I think it's individual, the way people approach this question of home, the way they struggle with accepting the fact that they may never go back home, or they may never even rebuild home in their new country. This tension, this contradiction between home there and home here is an ongoing struggle, at least for me, and I guess for a lot of people. So for me, I think it's just being open that wherever you feel a sense of home at the time could be your home.
Well, what I'm taking away from here is what you talked about. It's individual for different persons.
Yeah.
While you use the image of the the tortoise down here, someone like Romeo Oriogun in his Nomad made use of water as a way of escape, as a way of living, not just himself, but those who were forced out of the continent, and then water, which gets to be slow at the time and also fast in another way, captured the essence of exile for Romeo. And you are making use of the emblem down here of a tortoise. Is it a slow process for your own case, leaving, or is it something people just wake up and then decide to just leave? Because I'm trying to look at the tortoise down here as an animal that gets to move about, but also slowly.
Yeah, thank you for referencing Romeo's Nomad. And also in There Is More, you would notice that there's a lot of references to water,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
whether it's about water pollution or water as the means of transport for those who want to migrate into Europe, or
sure.
water as the place people meet their death because they can't cross over to Europe.
Just like the situations in Spain when you get to the bank of the river there for lots of Africans.
Yes, yeah. So for me, I don't think you can talk about migration without, particularly
Water.
from the African point of departure to Europe. And if you are crossing through the Sahara Desert through North Africa to Europe, water is your passage. And so, going back to the question of the tortoise, I think that slowness is also a way of contemplating, because for a consequential decision as home or thinking about home, you can't just be very fast and hasty about it. So you want to be very deliberate and gradual in how you come to terms with questions of home, because it implicates a lot of things: your well-being, your emotional investment, your material investment, your financial investment, and so many things have to be taken into account. And so you can't say, oh, I've left home, I've built a new home. But when you are building a new home, it's not your original home. And so you have to grapple with the everyday reality of being a foreigner or a stranger or even an alien in this new place. And so it's not a certainty that because you've left your former home and you've rebuilt a new home, that place is accepting of you. So it comes with its own complications, which you also have to address and recognize and live with. And so for me, I think I still struggle with that because my formative years were in Nigeria. I didn't come here as an 8-year old or as a teenager. I came here as an adult with my family. So I think maybe I'm caught uh, caught up between spaces, the space of my former home and the space of my new home. And within those spaces arise the tensions which I'm trying to live with, not necessarily reconcile, because maybe that's how I am. That's the way my own disposition to these matters are. As I mentioned earlier, that I don't have a definite answer
Sure.
to saying I'm home and this is home for me, because I mean, I have very good memories, fond memories of having lived in Nigeria. I have family, I have friends, I have connections, and I can't just say because I now live in Canada, I have to cut those connections. I mean, that would be cutting a part of myself, literally or metaphorically. So I think just being open that this is how life might be for you. You would grapple with these questions and you may not find any answers, and then that's okay.
Stories as geographies. One finds this in Double Wahala. The idea of stories as geography, and I'm just trying to I can't really remember completely which of the work I read that from. I think, but it's from the African Nobel laureate Adurazak. I think it's in the Sea or so, where he talked about, I speak to maps and sometimes maps get to speak to me also. First, the idea of double wahala. It's We all know the whole concept of double wahala, double trouble, but what inspired that? Not just the phrase. Now we know the phrase as it concerns we as Nigerians, but what are the emotional or cultural weights you get to you thought about before coming up with the title of that particular work? I know the content
Yeah.
But just for our listeners, and walk us through the thought process of how you arrived at double wahala, double trouble.
Yeah, so of course that double wahala is excuse me, it's a phrase coined by Fela, the legendary Afrobeat musician.
Yeah,
And I remember in the 80s he always said that Nigerians were suffering and smiling.
the same time.
And when I came up with the stories in the collection Double Wahala, Double Trouble, it registered to me that Nigerians have continued to be suffering and smiling. And unfortunately, the troubles have compounded rather than lessened. And unfortunately, still, Nigerians, at least many Nigerians, they've not had any succor or comfort from the avalanche of troubles in their lives, whether from past military tyrannies or from civil democracy inefficiencies. Just look at the last two, or the current president or the previous president. They've not offered Nigerians a much needed comfort from all the hardship, their policies, their style of government that created for Nigerians. And so when I wrote those stories, I was thinking about how trouble is almost ubiquitous for many Nigerians. The Nigerians, unlike other citizens of the world, that have the basic comforts, whether in terms of amenities, functional libraries, functional education system, good roads, available water supply, available fuel or gas or petrol supply, and all the things we take for granted in the West, in whether in Canada or in Europe or even in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, many of these things are lacking in Nigeria. And Nigerians become enmeshed in a cycle of troubles, hardship, poverty. And so that book was supposed to offer a way to think about the resilience of Nigeria against all this everyday trouble, but also to call attention to the unnecessary and gratuitous problems and violence Nigerians face in their lives. And so that book was, in as much as it explored the frequency of troubles in the lives of Nigerians, it's also a critique of the government failure, the government failing to provide basic comfort for hardworking, hopeful, and resilient Nigerians. So that was my own offering as a form of social criticism of the political anomaly in our beloved country, Nigeria.
Yeah, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, many times I've talked about, America not being hers, and if you give her everything within her reach, where she wants to be always, it's Nigeria. But she loves the light, she loves the fact that you can make orders and they come on time, and conversations in and about this. When you were writing these stories, when you were putting them together, did you know from the start you were putting together a collection that would do with such psychological and emotional rawness, or did these stories emerge organically, probably pulling you into directions you hadn't planned? Did you? I know there's a whole lot of conversations about the readiness of materials in the Nigerian space. In conversation also with, where I also asked a question about the readiness of and the availability of materials in the Nigerian space. How was the thought process putting this work together?
Well, I wouldn't say the stories came about organically, but I think because I've been thinking about the experiences of many Nigerians who live in adversity and who daily contend with the troubles in their lives and the state of disrepair in the country. So I think when I started writing those stories, they could speak to each other. And when I decided to bring them together, I think that's holistic and organic character came about. So I didn't set out initially to say, oh, I want to write about troubles in Nigerians' life. But because I was always attuned to the suffering of Nigerians, to the pain government policies or inefficient governments brings into the lives of Nigerians, it was easier for those stories to come to me as a form of social critique, in as much as they reflected the stories of ordinary Nigerians, but there are also stories about love, desire, family, infidelity, self acceptance, and hope. But then I didn't want to lose the fact that I wanted to point a finger at the government for not living up to the expectations of Nigerians.
The flesh of my flesh can be looked at from different perspectives, but if one wants to look at it from the author's perspective, what does this story mean to you personally, and how did you arrive at such a brutal yet quiet expression of love, grief, womanhood, and the conversations in between?
Yeah, so that's a story. So I was just thinking about sometimes the way people can take love to the extreme, or the violence that comes with a warped notion of love,
Sure.
and the extent some people can go to affirm their love for their beloved. So in that story, it was a way to think about complexity and mystery. And when people fall in love, or when people love someone, how far can they go to prove that love? And so you have this woman who cuts her finger and cooks it for the husband because the husband was being unfaithful to her. And so that way she said, okay, I'm going to give you a part of my body. So it's a bizarre story, but of course, I've also lived in Lagos where I've heard lots of bizarre stories. So I wanted to create this something similar to some of the stories I heard about love in Nigeria.
Yeah, it's just like in Damilare Kuku's collection. The very first story down there has this scene about the uncertainty of infidelity to one's relationship, and the idea of a woman threatening to chop off the husband's genital, and you get to see the conversation. I can't remember the auntie that rebuked the wife in that particular family's dispute as to women shouldn't talk like that. Don't you know that's your husband? And all those type of conversation. On a lighter note, people get to talk about tattooing their partners on their body and all that. But this idea of falling in love, like the literal sense, English language is your major. But before the philosophical idea of it, just the idea of falling in love, what does it do to somebody? Like just falling in love, like maybe you're on like the second, third floor, and then you fall. That kind of literal way of looking at it. How do people manage the idea of love in the real sense, and then in the vague sense, or in the lustful sense also?
So I'm not a philosopher of love, but I can say that love entails being exposed, being naked, being vulnerable. Because to fall in love means that you are giving yourself over, or giving yourself to someone, affording someone a sense of responsibility and commitment to protecting you, to being with you in every sense imaginable, whether emotionally, physically, relationally, or even sexually. And so, because most people, of course, are naturally humans, are afraid of being invulnerable because we're always protective and defensive. So, to fall in love in a way subverts that way of being in the world. And so, it takes a lot of courage for me, at least, to fall in love because it's saying, this is me. Here I am. Take me, own me, possess me. I'm giving you my all. I am without you. Without you, I have no control, or I have no sovereignty over myself. And so it becomes an act of being vulnerable, being exposed, being naked, and then sharing the ownership of the self with another. And so ordinarily people wouldn't want to be in that state. But then love is a beautiful, life affirming thing because we are created to be social and relational beings. And so, to what extent can we escape the potential or the capacity of love if we choose to live alone?
Wow. At a time when we find ourselves at this, uh, when we're talking about experience and we're talking about research interests, your work has looked into the society and has reflected deeply into that. We live in a time in a place like Nigeria where many persons, have come to have this transactional sense to relationships. I know it's not something that started yesterday, but the way it's now presented on the media, with we coming face to face with this information day to day, it looks as though things are changing. To borrow Bob Dylan down there, like the times are changing and they are changing so fast. How should we as Africans be looking at love? And if you have an idea of what love used to mean for our ancestors, not ancestors maybe 500 years ago, maybe ancestors the near here with us, how has love changed? How has the economy of a place like Nigeria affected what many persons come to hold as love? And by extension, not just Nigeria, we see it also in the West, and we see different ways of people coming to interpret love.
Well, I don't know the origin of love, and I don't know how love has evolved. But I think every culture has their own understanding of what love is. And at least on the basic level, love is selfless. Love is not exploitative, and love is not transactional. Rather, love is relational. And so, love, like any other affective structure, can also be co-opted or exploited or taken advantage of. You may love someone and they may not really love you, but they love you for some other purpose. And so I think that has always been with human culture because you have people who would want to take advantage or exploit you under the guise of love. So, but which is why I say I don't know if love has evolved. What I know is that people may interpret love or perceive love in their own way when they have their own agenda. But love is constant. Love does not exploit. Love does not violate. Love does not injure or wound the beloved. And so when people claim to love you and then they exploit and take advantage of you, actually they never meant to love you in the first place. So that's where the transactional character of that pseudo love comes in. And that for me is not love because love does not leave one in pain or in misery.
Many persons will come to debate this because we now live in these times where we think everything should be in and about acting, everything should be in and about what you see on the media spaces we get to find around our cell phones and the different apps we get to log in and the different sites we get to visit. And persons are struggling these days to differentiate between fiction and reality, which has given rise to conversations like village people born out of Nollywood to a large extent. Somebody shouldn't go back to the village because he goes back to the village, there's an auntie watching such a person, or there's an uncle watching such a person down there. And then you look at neighbors in your collection of stories, you see this tension, this constant sense of, watching and being watched, of closeness and distance at the same time. You build a tension that, feels both psychological and sensual to a large extent, if I should say. Will you speak about, your approach in writing about desires, especially when it is tangled with fear, to a large extent, attraction, secrecy, and vulnerability? Was this born out of Lagos, face me, I face you, or just this societal way of stalking people and trying to distance people and not letting them come so close?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I was thinking about male violence, gender violence, domestic violence,
Yeah.
and the falseness of personality when I read Neighbors, that particular story. And so you see, and sometimes we think we know people just by looking at them or
Sure.
just by the kind of car they drive or the job they have. And then we are easily, so in a way, that story is like all that glitters is not gold.
Sure.
And then some people have more than one face, or some people move around with a mask. And so until you peel off that mask, you may not see the real persona of that person. So that story was a way to think about facade, false personality, and behind the face we see there may be a nasty, ugly person behind that face. And so that's what I wanted to do with that story, to think about how sometimes some people in a marriage, they could be men or women, but they are suffering in that marriage. And then in that sense, love becomes perverted to further the one of the spouse's agenda, whether it's to dominate, control, or to subjugate the other partner. So that's what that story afforded me, a way to think through questions of marital violence, male violence, domestic abuse, and hypocrisy.
You see this across many histories. You meet, women who carry pain, women who carry pain of silence, and they get to endure betrayal, displacement, and the emotional fallout of either absence or unreliable partners. Would you say you were intentionally giving space for women's inner lives and experiences and to talk about them just the same way we saw recently Dream Count of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie trying to talk about the lives of these four women that were the central role in her book? Did you set out clearly to expose the difficulties many women in our society get to face?
Yes, I think because most times we hear men generally, or men as a social group, control the narratives
Yeah,
about life, about culture, and about society. And in doing so, women's stories are not heard, or sometimes they are ignored or even eluded from all these narratives by men. And so, what's one of the aims of that book, Double Wahala, Double Trouble, was to probe the inner lives and struggles and suffering of women, to bring it to the fore so we can have conversations about those matters. And because I'm also interested in gender justice, gender equality, and as a scholar of masculinities, I
sure.
think that's my own contribution to supporting the feminist project of calling attention to women's pain and suffering and how men can help to mitigate this pain by being more conscious of their power, their privilege, and how society has afforded them a different value of being in the world. So those were some of the concerns I had while writing those stories and then making them recognize the pain of the female pain. In a way, I think my one of my mentors, Chilo Zona Eze, always talks about feminist empathy. That most times it's not as if men don't suffer or men don't suffer one form of violence or another by fellow men or by some women, but generally, women as a social group, they suffer more than men. And so perhaps if we're looking at creating a society that is more inclusive, more humane, we must also pay attention to how women suffer in society.
In Dear Jewale, the feminist manifestos in 15 suggestions, you see this conversation also how we should talk about masculinity and femininity. what should men be doing, like in practical terms, to come on board? What should the first man do? I know men have already been talking. Let's assume we're in that utopia where men have not been doing anything and these conversations have been swept under the carpet. What should the first set of men do to influence the next set of men to build a society where women's problems are looked at, and we also look at what our roles have been in contributing to the pains of our sisters?
Well, I don't have 15 suggestions. I think the men should do is to listen to women's stories. And in listening to women's stories, they shouldn't feel that women are indicting men individually, but women are indicting men as a group. So, and on the individual level, men should be conscious of how they relate with women so they don't harm women, not only in their relationship, but in the language and the vocabulary they use. They should be careful so they don't use language that is misogynistic, sexist, or degrading of women. So their language, their action, and then men perhaps should learn not to fear women and see women as people who are working for men's downfall. I think those are some of the suggestions I have. And men, of course, should educate fellow men rather than encouraging those men to degrade women, particularly in when men are together or they are drinking together or they're in different activities together or whatever social circles they find themselves. They shouldn't accommodate such language or interactions that dehumanize or demonize women. And men should also make efforts to educate their sons, nephews, and their cousins, their male cousins, so they can be sensitive to women's problems and know that together we can create a more wholesome society for everyone involved. So those are my suggestions.
And as it concerns the mental health and the trauma, that we get to see as recurring threats also down here, you see glaringly before you when you look at the piece. This is how I remember her, where a mother's breakdown is seen through her child's eyes and all that. Are women speaking out enough, and what are the things that are preventing them from speaking out, and what could be done to make more women get to speak up and say their mind, and say the piece of the problems they get to face in their life and in their relationships?
I think women have been speaking out. The question would be, have men been listening and have men been taking action? So we can't continue if women are, it's like expecting the person who is victimized or who is wounded to keep speaking about their pain when your work is to find a way to allay their pain. And so
Yeah.
women have been speaking out. Like if you look at all the novels or literature written by women since the early 70s from
From
Florence
Buche Mesheta to Florent Wapa.
to Tessa Women, all those people. I mean, they've been writing about women's experiences. So the question, if they've been writing about this for the past 40 or 50 years, so the question would be, what have men been doing? How much action has men taken to address those issues that still come up now and again? So I think the question should be directed more to men should start doing more rather than expecting women to speak up more.
About children's literature and what we give our children nowadays to get to read. Recently, the conversation have been about children have been spending so much time on TikTok. That's why they are failing JAM, and that's why they are failing WAEC. There might be merit to that, but I don't think that's the beginning of the problem. I think we have an educational system that have not really looked at our problems from the roots. You talked about access to libraries and all that. You also write of books for children and stories for children also. How important is this in a culture like us, where almost every home gets to talk about the idea of, Christmas clothes and Easter clothes and all that. But sometimes little mention is made of books for children and gifts for children like that. What should we be doing? You as a writer, and what should many persons out there who want to look into children's book be looking at in terms of setting, in terms of the consciousness that needs to go into the, if I should say loosely, the philosophy they get to employ before writing for children?
For me, when I write, I don't think I write for children with any agenda. I just want to write a story that is uplifting, that is entertaining, that provokes children to think. So I don't go and write for children to say, oh, don't play a game or don't be this or that. I'm not there to legislate or to moralize. But I think in as much as all these challenges are there for parents trying to get their children to read, one of the failings of our government, Nigerian government in particular, has been its inability to fully furnish and equip all the libraries in secondary and primary schools. There's a library deficit in Nigeria. Many of the libraries are in a state of disrepair. And then the government can institute reading programs, initiatives that drive reading as fun. The government has not invested a fraction in doing that. So perhaps if you have a government that doesn't read, that doesn't appreciate books, how can you have its citizens appreciate books? So I think the reading culture has to be revived and revitalized. And the government and other corporate stakeholders should be at the forefront when they make reading fun, when they make reading entertaining, and when they make reading as a cultural movement. It becomes easier for parents and every other stakeholder to encourage, to boost, and to invest in sustaining a vibrant, robust reading culture. So parents can do their own, but government also has to do a lot more because people are paying taxes. So what is the government doing with all the resources Nigeria has? So education has to be funded in more significant ways than the government has been doing in the past 20, 30 years until we fund our education, until we elevate the standards of education. We will continue having children who don't want to spend any time reading or thinking about books. So we should revive the library. We should subsidize publishing in Nigeria. We should provide subventions and funding for local and medium scale and corporate publishers in Nigeria. I think that's my 2 cents, as they say.
Look at the story in the Wishmaker down here. You see conversations in and about single parenting, or maybe at the demise of one parent. Here a child seeks out a memorable Christmas, but then faced with poverty and conversations about that. As it concerns, NGOs, I have volunteered in a couple of NGOs a few years ago that makes it possible for families to come pick up some toys, and such desires of Bele would have been met if she found herself in a society that also get to value this. How much more should people try to give back to the society as it's captured in the Wishmaker, and what should we be doing individually as much as we also want the government to come into play? Because if you also look at the idea of funding, be it scholarships and grants and conversations in and about this, you see that the society where people get to live in, be it in Canada, in the US, in the UK, or in Europe, many persons are pushing their personal funds into research projects for people and all that, and building private libraries and playgrounds also for kids. Should we be looking at that also? Are we doing enough, or we have not even started?
Well, in these countries you've mentioned, the standard of living is high. The disposable income is high.
Sure.
Majority of the people can give back to society. In Nigeria, can we say the same? In Nigeria, the
Not really.
standard of living is poor, disposable income is poor. If you are struggling to survive, how can you give what you don't have? If you can't pay for your children's school fees, would it be wise for you to take a fraction of that to flow back into the society? No, which is why the government has to lead the way, has to uplift people so people can take and see that the government is responsible, the government is accountable, and so if they invest in the society, they are doing the right thing and they know that the government will recompense them somehow. So you can't be struggling and invest in a society where the government is unresponsive and irresponsible.
That's a lot to take down there. Many persons don't get to see this from this particular lens. They just look about just this blind comparison between we and the West, and conversations about conversations about elections and getting leaders, have been left to a large extent to tribal and emotional, let's say sentimental ways of getting to pick leaders. For how long should we continue like this, and what role should education play in a time as crucial as ours, coming to pick leaders who get to look at our problems? And you see people getting to support their tribesmen one way or the other, and they get to fall back to party leanings and all that. But the problems get to continue, like you said from the very beginning of our conversation down here. Many persons have not been granted succor at least once in their life. It's like from one trouble to the next. If they don't have double problem, they don't have double trouble, they get to have double wahala. At
Mhm.
what point should the citizenry look at themselves and say, we've had enough? And beyond theory, try to, and by no means saying Nigerians have not been doing that. We've been doing the much we can, but as a writer and as a public intellectual, at what defining moment are we going to change things and turn things around?
I don't know if I'm a public intellectual yet, but I also can't speak to when is the right moment for Nigerians to continue mobilizing and advocating for good governance. I think Nigerians have been doing that and they will continue to do that within the resources and capacities they have. I've not lost hope, but of course, I feel there are moments I feel sad about the state of things in the country. But I think Nigerians are doing the much they can because it's not easy to sustain a fight when you are habitually wounded. So I think we should cut some Nigerians some slack,
Sure.
and each of us should do what we can to do, whether it's in the form of education, it's in form of sustaining this kind of conversation, creating spaces for people to reflect on these questions, writing, publishing, promoting works, and then doing the best you can do to forward the advocacy and the consciousness raising in the country. So it's easier to complain and then to lose hope, but action demands a lot of effort. So I think that's what I expect each and every one of us to be doing, rather than just losing hope.
Sure. There's this kind of ethical tension in your stories, and by no means saying you don't moralize, but to a large extent you don't moralize. But the reader is constantly aware that choices have consequences to a large extent, and sometimes devastating consequences at that. Do you think of fiction as a moral space, or you are more interested in ambiguity and letting readers wrestle with questions on their own? And I, for one, get to look at Toni Morrison talking about the dangers of art can be perceived to be dangerous because of how many persons have lost their life in trying to present art to the people. Look at the author of Satanic Verse. At the point, had two eyes. I was just listening to his Oxford speech many years ago, but now you see him putting on different lens. One dark and then one transparent.
So I think as a writer, your work is just to capture a glimpse or a strand of human experience. And human experience is always fraught with questions about ethics, politics, morality, religion, gender, sexuality, all the things that compose and constitute human experience. And so I don't go into writing to preach or to moralize because people are just as complex and conflicted or complicated as they are. So my own is just to see if I can get a snapshot of a character's life, reflective of human experience, and then allow my readers to do with that experience or that snapshot or glimpse with whatever they want to do with it. And of course, some people will read a piece of literature in a particular way. Others will read it in a way that is contrary to what the writer has written. And so it's not the writer's business because people come into a work of literature from a different background, which may be completely different from that of the writer. But then the thing is that literature has capacity to incite conversations that are uncomfortable for a good number of people, and rightly so. And so some people find finding literature an uncomfortable truth, and that's okay. But the beauty of literature is that it asks us to imagine or reimagine what life could be or what life is for some people who are not as privileged as we are. And more importantly, it's also a way of thinking about the other, which is what much of literature does, to call attention to the other's pain and asks us to identify or to even work to lessen the other's pain. And that's how I perceive literature when I write.
Yeah, postcard from a war-torn village, and a couple of other poems in your collection of There Is More. There's more in these collections we can explore, but for want of time, also we might not be able to do that. You see, the whole idea of the morning after the protest. These were conversations. These are poems I, one way or the other, would have loved to pinpoint and get to ask you one question or the other from. What give about this title? There is more. There is more to war. There is more to ethnic divide, or what?
Yeah, so there is more could suggest a plethora of things. And depending on how one looks at it, there's more suffering, but there's also a potential for more joy. There's more hate, but there's also a possibility of more love. Yeah. So there's more of all these different affective and emotional experiences. So I think, but for me, my usage of more alludes to possibilities, to thinking about different forms of how we can not lose hope, but to sustain hope in the midst of war, deprivation, degradation, and all the messiness and craziness that is happening in the world. So even though we seem to be in a time where there's more polarizing activities within the body politic or society, but there's more activities that also reflect our capacity to change, to mobilize, and then to support and care for each other. And so it's in that sense that I use more, not more in, as a negative or a deficit, or more as a positive and as a sign of plenitude, plenty in its positive sense. So I think that's the sense in which I'm using there is more. So, and there's more, not only because when we think about particularly human experiences, it's much easier to think about hardship, adversity, precarity, and then we lose sight of the miracle of being alive, the grace of being able to do something you are passionate about or something you love. So while thinking about the scarcity or depth, we're also thinking about plenty and plenitude. So that's the sense I'm using. There is more. So there's more to life beyond suffering. There's more to life beyond hate, fear, and terror. And this more speaks to our capacity to change, to support, to nurture community and relationalities that transcend such deficits or scarce mentality of scarceness that pervade our social space and life in most cases. Yeah.
Thank you for that great input down there. Writer's block. Do you get to experience that, or is it an excuse many persons get to come up with as it concerns, having that particular phase, or it's actually something that really exists?
Well, I think something I don't know if I've experienced that because I write when I feel I need to write. So I know some people experience it. I don't know why or how, but I don't think I've really experienced that. So I just say, oh, I want to write this. And if I'm not able to pull that off, I just take a break and do something else and later come back to it. So maybe that moment could be interpreted as a writer's block, but otherwise, I think I reach my limits and then take a break and find some way to recharge and come back to that.
Do you think that is because probably you're a scholar and then you have lots of stuff to also do as opposed to being a writer who writes and writes alone?
It's possible. And because I have a life other than writing, being a writer is just one facet of my life. I mean, I have a family, I'm a son, I'm a husband, as well as a father and brother. So these are also important aspects of my life I can't take for granted. So I think some people, their own vocation is just to write, and then they write from the greater part of the day. For me, I don't have that luxury or privilege or that compulsion to write every day. So it's not as if I'm discounting their experience, but I think in a way I'm fortunate to be able to have these other varied identities that demand equal urgency as much as writing does in some cases.
But at what point do you get to see the balance here? Or you give one the time it needs to be, it needs the time one aspect needs to be given the time it needs to, or you just see it as, the everything happening at the same time. So there's writing, there's family, there's the extended family, there's social life, and then there's academic life. Or you allocate time and try to see how you strike a balance down here.
So I don't say, oh, this is the balance. What I do is just to move with the flow because you can't, for me, I don't think you can plan or regulate life.
Sure.
Sometimes things happen and then you have to move with the flow. So for me, it's more about being open and adaptable, not being rigid and inflexible to know that, oh, sometimes something may happen. I have to leave this and attend to that. So always flowing with the tide of the day or of the moment rather than saying, I want to be in control or I have to regulate this. So that's the way I find my own balance.
And speaking about balance, also, like I said from the very beginning, there's this tension between different factions and different schools as to what African literature really entails and who is an African writer. I don't know how I don't know how strong the arguments are at the moment, but in philosophy, you would have seen that conversation as to what makes for African literature. And Father Innocent of UNN had even written a book, the African origin of Greek philosophy, and conversations like that. As it concerns our own space and our concern now, which happens to be literature and the academic, do you see tension there as to what makes for an African writer? Is it someone who writes about Africa? Is it someone who lives in Africa? And by Africa, one might say, I live in Nigeria and I'm called a Nigerian writer, and I don't live in, let's say, Akwa Ibom. Do I have the right to write about Akwa Ibom, since we are making the argument that an African writer should be one who lives in the continent? And if the person lives in the continent and lives in a particular country, does the person have the right to write about another country? So that would be my own argument for what makes an African writer, but I don't know what your own take would be.
Well, I don't know if those arguments are productive. And for me, I don't get into unproductive things
Sure.
because I have limited time, energy, and resources to devote to such arguments that don't take me anywhere. I think I would rather be writing than arguing about some of those things. So categorization, classifications within the African frame of scholarship and critique, I try not to get drawn into that.
What does it look like a day in your life as an academic and one who gets to go look at the students' life, and are the concerns as the ones we get to see in your writings and your essays and your stories, or they're entirely different, pulled out of this? Because I am just imagining there shouldn't be, because it's still in and about your area of studies and your area of specialty.
Well, if my day starts with attending to my family, I, I do my family responsibilities, and once I'm done with that, I go to school, teach, attend to students, attend to committee meetings, and that. So I don't know if. So I think in a way, my day just structured around that. So family, work, and back to family. So I think that's how it goes, and I try to do the best I can in meeting these commitments. And if I can't, that's life. I don't expect myself to be perfect or infallible, and I cut myself some slack because I am only human. I'm not an android or a cyborg. So I do what I can do within my capability. So yeah.
Wow, wow,
Yeah.
what a way of getting to live life and getting to strike a balance down there for yourself and for a whole lot of other persons down there. You you have certain works you've been looking at, the whole idea of you also participating as an editor in the anthology. Please don't interrupt. What shouldn't people be interrupting? What should people just sit down and pay attention and not get to interrupt in the flow? This particular work you jointly edited with I think Rhoda. What should people not be interrupting here?
We're not saying people should not be interrupting, but we're saying that one has to be alert to how life or situations or moments or circumstances can interrupt life. But one should also be open to how life can take a different path. And that path can be as unsettling as it is exciting. And so interruptions happen every day in people's life. So it depends on how you want to deal with that. And so the anthology offers different ways for writers to think about how life or how interruption plays out in their lives. So, and they embrace it, whether they're embracing or they are resisting or they are reckoning with it. But this is a way to make people to think about and appreciate the various forms interruption can take in their life.
We really appreciate you coming by and granting us the chance to get to talk to you about the conversations we've been having. We've been talking to Nigerian writer, poet, scholar, and a cultural thinker. He has refused the tag of public intellectual, but we understand why it ordinarily should be like that. From
I'm still
Nigeria to
an imagine intellectual.
Sure. We've looked at his works. He's granted us an hour plus to get to talk to him. We've looked at Double Wahala, Double Trouble. We've looked at the intersection of literature and society. We've looked at the pain women get to carry silently and the conversations in and about the need for libraries and the need for other amenities we at the moment are not having. We've looked at how the economy also gets to affect one way or the other the things and the ways in which we get to live our lives. And we've reflected to a large extent how many Nigerians have moved from one problem to the other without any succor and without any need for a time and space for themselves to say what the president at the moment himself is not doing. Let the poor breathe. The poor have not been breathing in the country. You can check out his works. Doctor has been writing for a very long time now. So his works are available in the country and out of the country. Also, is published with the Canadian publisher BB and other places. Also, you can find his works. You can get them on Amazon, and I will tag a link to where you can get to have access to these books and get to buy them, read them, and let us continue these conversations and let us see what African literature can do. And not just African literature, not boxing and contextualizing these tags as Doctor have set down here. We should also look at the broader picture of what migration can do for you, what it can do for me, and what it can do for your family in connection with the current realities we find ourselves as human beings and as global citizens looking for new ways of socializing in the current global structure we find ourselves. Doctor, thank you for coming on Boring Conversations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ogina Emeka, and it's been a pleasure discussing with you. We still have cold in Canada, so that's for my dryness. Yeah, and so I applaud this project you're doing, and I applaud your drive and capacity to foster a space where this kind of conversations can take place and then engage writers, intellectuals, critics, and thinkers, and think about how we can continue to generate ideas and insights into whether African literature, culture, uplifting our society, and supporting these conversations to get to the mainstream public spaces. And I think you are doing a wonderful job and continue to do this job. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you. If you've listened to this particular point, please do like, drop a comment, share with your family members. And we've not had a boring conversation. Every other thing we've had here is anything but boring. I'm your host, Biringkpa Mecca. See you next time.
Thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of the weekend.
Thank you, Doctor.